So through your book and through some other videos, you have been introduced to some of the reasons for the Italian Renaissance. This concept of humanism and how it has been sort of brought back, this revival of classical Greek and Roman thought, Greek and Roman culture. But what caused this proliferation of Renaissance ideas in the arts? Well, there are several major factors here. One of them is economic prosperity. There is more money, especially at this point in history in Italy. There's a lot of factors contributing this, but one of the major factors is exploration, colonization, and just in general increase in trade. And this is creating an economic boom, especially in Italy and especially in Florence, Italy, which is really the birthplace of the Renaissance. Another major factor is the sort of rise of merchant and banking families within Florence. These families, very powerful families like the Medici family, for instance, are hiring many artists to decorate their homes and their palaces and their villas. And this is giving Renaissance artists a lot more freedom. Because when your only patron is the Catholic Church, well, there's limitations to the kinds of experimentations that artists could do within a church. But if you are a private homeowner, you're a wealthy family like the Medici family, then your artists are given a lot more room to experiment, a lot more room to try things. And another major change in Renaissance art is the way artists perceive themselves and the way other people perceive artists. Before the Renaissance, artists are primarily seen as craftspeople. You hire an artist to do a certain job, and you may hire that artist based on their skill and also how much they're going to charge you, and all kind of the typical things that we hire any sort of craft person for. But something begins to change in the Renaissance that is significant, and that is the way artists are perceived. Artists are thought to have some sort of almost kind of a special power because they can copy what God can do. Now, the idea is that only God can make a tree, but an artist can make a copy of that tree, and that makes that artist special. It gives them a touch of the divine. And then you sort of couple that, you sort of bring in this idea of Renaissance individualism, this Renaissance concept of self-improvement, and what you get is this idea of kind of the superstar artist. 100 years before, in the Middle Ages, the idea of a famous artist would have been absurd. It would have been ridiculous. There would have been no such thing. A famous artist, why not have a famous bricklayer or a famous plumber? But because of this idea that the artist had the touch of the divine, changes that. But also this idea that self-improvement is important, because part of Renaissance humanism is this idea not only can man improve himself, but man should improve himself. Man has a moral obligation to God to improve himself. God gave us a brain. God gave us these hands to make things, to build things with. And if we don't use these gifts that God has given to us, then we are sort of morally at fault. That is almost an affront to God. And so the question is, how do you measure that you have been improving yourself, that you have been exerting your own will and seeking something greater and trying to achieve something better? Well, one of the primary ways is through fame. And so in the Renaissance, we see artists start to achieve this level of fame that nobody really had before, except for, poets or theologians. And in the Renaissance, we have this concept of the famous artist, of the celebrity artist. And celebrity comes from the word meaning to one who is celebrated for their achievements. And so this is a significant change in the way artists are perceived in the Renaissance. So how do these changes manifest themselves in art? Well, there's several different identifying factors of Renaissance art, but really kind of what it boils down to is there's an increase in realism, there is an interest in human anatomy. There is a development of the technique of chiaroscuro, which uses value and shading to create the illusion of a three-dimensional object. And there is the development of a technique that you guys should already be familiar with called linear perspective. And linear perspective and realism kind of go hand in hand. So part of the reason why art starts to look more realistic is because artists want to create a human eye view of the world. We don't view the world as flat. We view the world realistically in three dimensions. And so there is a desire in this humanist environment to create a human-eyed view of the world. The Middle Ages rejected realism because they associated it with paganism. There was also the fear that realism could lead to idol worship. So in the Middle Ages, art became more abstract, and realism sort of went away, and eventually artists lost the ability to create realistic looking works of art because the skills weren't needed. But in the Renaissance, that realism comes back. And one of the ways that realism manifests itself is through linear perspective, this very mathematically precise way of visualizing three-dimensional space. And this kind of ties also into the concept of the Renaissance view of the world, which is that the world is rational. The world can be understood by the human brain through mathematics, through observation. And so we should create a visual depiction of that world through art that is based on science and based on math. The third major factor of Renaissance art is the interest in the human body, and especially in the nude form. In the Renaissance, we see the reintroduction of nudity, and primarily through Donatello's sculpture of David for the Medici family. There's that very powerful family again I told you about just moments ago. But this is the first monumental nude created since classical antiquity, since the age of the Roman Empire. And as you can see, we have this statue not only nude in the kind of classical Greek fashion, but also it is standing in that traditional contrapposto position, which is something that was loved by the Greeks and the Romans. So, what we're seeing here in the Renaissance is a tremendous change in the arts, because humanism brings in a whole new way of looking at the role of the artist and what art should look like. And it's going to eventually sort of trickle out of Italy and influence the rest of Europe, and then eventually will become sort of the foundation of how artists are perceived and what art is supposed to look like, well, up until the modern day.